Okay, I also want to thank everyone who was responsible for putting this event together, this panel and the festival, Mahen and Don and Manthia as well, and also the other panelists, because I feel like I've learned a lot just this afternoon. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction. In thinking about popular culture and African film, I began at first to think about the idea of the city in African film, which is something that I'm especially interested in. And this is something that Manthia has done some work on as well, the idea of urban space as a kind of contested space in the way that urban space is constructed in African film. And so I was interested in films like Jean-Pierre Bekelo's Quartier Mozart and Mirzak Alwash's Bab el Oued City, and also Drissa Touré's film Haramuya, which are very much about very specific spaces, even spaces within the city and subcultures within the urban culture. So that was what I was going to do, and then I saw Girl 6, and I sort of had to change everything for two reasons. I thought two things, first of all. First of all, I thought, well, finally we have our own Pretty Woman, for what that's worth. But also I thought I could never imagine a film like this being produced anywhere in Africa, and why not? One of the significant differences and the sort of ongoing and long-standing differences, I think, between African-American film and African cinema is sex. The visual iconography of African Americans has been forever a highly sexualized iconography, and that's been largely done and accomplished through cinema. From The Birth of a Nation to Josephine Baker's films to Girl 6. There's a huge kind of landscape of representation of black people in the West that is about their existence as sexual beings. And it's a very different context, I think, when we begin to talk about African subjects, continental African subjects. For instance, there is a huge and prolific black and interracial pornography industry in the U.S. That doesn't have a corollary anywhere else. African filmmakers themselves often deal with and treat sexuality and sex in a way that one doesn't ever find, and one probably will never find among African filmmakers. I think of the beginning of Melvin Van Peebles' film Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. I think of Girl 6. And there's just something that is very much different there. There appears to be a kind of a silence or a gap in what one might call the kind of provisionary canon of African cinema around sex and around representation of sexuality, and that for me is sort of an interesting question to explore. For me, the silence was broken very recently, a couple of weeks ago, when Harry Allen showed up on an African cinema conference on the internet and asked a question, quite bold, straight up. He said, "Does anybody know of any African erotic films?" And African erotic films. I thought, well, that's, I would never even have thought to ask that question, because it just, it seemed to me clear that that was a kind of a contradiction in terms, that it's just not a concern from what I know of African filmmakers. But then I began to think about it more, and it's not as if, Harry Allen is someone who is unaware of the kind of context of cultural production in Africa. So the question, I think, began to be about not so much, where can I find some African erotic films, as it was, what is the nature of this gap? What is the nature of this silence? Two things happened on that conference. One was, first of all, no one knew of a single African erotic film, and this is, from the assembled wisdom of dozens of scholars and experts and fans of African film, but also the discussion broadened from, whether or not there were African erotic films, which is in the end not such an important question, but it broadened to the question of the erotic in African films, which for me is much more interesting. Zainabu Irene Davis came up with Jibril Diop Membetti's Tuki Buki and Desiree Ekare's Faces of Women. Mark Reed came on with Fareed Bougadir's Halfouine, which he feels is one of the most sensual films he's ever seen. And there are a bunch of others one could add. Quartier Mozart, actually, is very much about sex and a kind of a satire around sexuality. Bab el Oued City, for me, has an incredibly erotic scene when the woman, the sort of sister who is being oppressed by her Islamic fundamentalist brother, Yamina, and she's forced to wear the veil. The scene where she unveils herself in a public place to her lover is just an incredibly charged scene, charged because there is the constant threat of violence in it, but also because it's a very kind of sensual scene in the way that the characters interact. I think of Flora Gomez's film, The Blue Eyes of Yanta, and for some reason, there's this one image in particular that sticks with me from that film where Yanta is wearing this big belt which has a huge watch in the center. It looks like something that Flavor Flav used to wear. And it's this kind of fetish for me because it's this, first of all, it's a bizarre thing that draws attention to itself whenever she is on screen. But also it's the sort of the way it's placed on her body and the way she kind of uses and the way the other characters respond to it just makes me think that there's this kind of sexual standing in for something else in that particular object. So the discussion in this group began to be about all the ways that African films may not explicitly show sexuality, but do deal very much with pleasure offered, pleasure deferred, pleasure delayed, those sorts of things. And from all of that, certain things began to sort of come up. First of all, that African filmmakers are not likely to make films for the purpose of getting people off. That is simply not an issue in a context where there are just so many other important things to make films about, to leave it at its simplest level. But also that, sexual representation in African cinema, where it has been present, has followed a sort of set of unwritten codes that kind of describe the range and the presence, I think, of possible erotic elements. There are, of course, differences in different parts of Africa in different sort of filmmaking contexts. Obviously, filmmakers in Islamic countries have a very different set of circumstances to work with around representation than filmmakers in more secular countries. There are other sort of factors, I think, that account for the kind of gap that I spoke about in terms of sexual representation. First among them, I think, would be the conditions of production. The financing for most African films comes from a combination of government sources. Government sources always have strings attached, and whether you're talking about African governments or European governments, usually in this case the French government, there is a kind of a prescription that goes along with the check. With the French government in particular, I would say that there is often a kind of a caretaking aspect to what subjects are deemed suitable for films. And many African filmmakers have complained about the sort of patronizing nature of the funding of their films. It's almost in a way, in talking about it in this context, it's almost in a way that the African artists are treated as children, and children don't have sex, so sex is inappropriate for an African film. There's also, I think, among filmmakers, obviously, a kind of among many African filmmakers, a pedagogical imperative, where, as I say, there are simply more important things to make films about, but also that the films themselves, because they are expensive to make in a context where expense is a political issue, and because it takes so much effort and time and energy to get an African filmmaker to the point where he or she is able to actually get a film produced, there is a kind of a duty or a responsibility that goes along with taking up that position as a filmmaker. Whether one talks about oneself as a filmmaker as a griot or not, there is, I think, usually among African filmmakers a sense of responsibility, what I call in the context of Black Canadian filmmaking, actually, where it also exists, a cinema of duty. There is also, of course, the very important question of Western contamination, sexual representation on screen, and especially the sexual representation of Black faces and Black bodies and Black subjects, having been so thoroughly colonized already. by a long history of racist narrative films, by obviously pornography, also I think by ethnography, which turns sexual behavior into a kind of an object of scientific curiosity. And this, I think, is related to that sort of infantilizing aspect that I talked about earlier in terms of how the films are funded and what that means. So these, I think, are some of the factors that account for that gap. And yet, there is, as I said, sexuality. In fact, one of the participants in this conference on the net said that when she teaches Yelen to her students in South Africa, one of them in particular commented that there was too much pornography in it. And that was, to me, a very surprising thing. And she made the very, I think, important point that obviously sexuality and clearly pornography is in the eye of the beholder. And in the case of this one student, that film, which many other viewers would think is not at all sexually explicit, was deemed pornographic. There is, I think, also the influence, and this is something that may in fact increase, that the sort of art film, in particular the French art film, has had on the representation of gender and the representation of sex in certain African films, for both, to both good and bad ends, I think. Jean-Marie Thénault's new film, Clando, has some very kind of tender, intimate love scenes that have sort of a psychological presence and a character motivation, and also a sort of épate-les-bourgeois sort of sensibility within them that I think is very much influenced by sort of history of European art cinema. There are also a certain number of sexual types in African film that do exist, even where there isn't explicit sexual representation. I would say the female victim is chief among them. There are many, many films about the oppression of women, usually made by male filmmakers, actually, interestingly enough. And there is almost a kind of a subgenre recently of films, documentaries and fiction films about female genital mutilation. And those kinds of films in particular, I think, can kind of stand in as the exemplar of the sort of African woman as victim, as sexual victim film. There's a furor right now that's happening over a film that's about to come out by Ingrid Sinclair in Zimbabwe called Flame, which is about the history of the liberation movement and the war in Zimbabwe from the point of view of the women soldiers, and including scenes of rape of the women soldiers by their fellow male liberation fighters, not by the other side. And there's been a furor over this because Ingrid Sinclair, and the film generally, is calling into question the history of that liberation war, where to ascribe blame, the kind of political dynamics of rape. Lots of very, very difficult questions for a society that has only recently, that is still, I think, coming to grips with what that war meant. One of the other sexual types that one sees in a lot of African films is the cuckold, or the impotent man. In Hala, one sees that, and in a number of other African films. Obviously, that type and that tradition, that narrative, didn't spring from film, but has a long history in the oral tradition as well. And another interesting point, I think, in Hala and in other films is that sex in African cinema tends very often to be linked to comedy, which I think indicates both a kind of an honest acceptance of how funny sex can be, but also a kind of movement away from a more serious sort of erotic dimension in sexuality. So all of these are just sort of points for discussion. These are just sort of things that I'm bringing up as a way of hoping to open a debate about the subject. In terms of what's happening now, I would say there is a sort of gradual opening up of sexual subjects and sexual representation in what you could call the mainstream of African cinema in sort of Francophone West Africa. In the Maghreb countries, obviously Islamic law is shutting down the range of representation. As you may know, if you are if you have a married couple in a film produced in a country that's ruled by Islamic law, unless the actors themselves are married, one cannot show them touching on screen. And so that, of course, limits, the range of possibilities. So at the same time as we have Islamic law influencing representation, as we have a sort of gradual opening up in the Francophone West African countries, we also have things like Jan Kerkhoff, who is an expatriate South African based in Amsterdam, who made a film which was at FESPACO last year in Burkina Faso called Confessions of a Yeovil Rapist. And Yeovil is kind of like the Soho of Johannesburg, sort of a trendy neighborhood. And it's a very brutal film that deals with a sort of outburst of incredibly brutal violence in a seemingly calm and placid and very trendy neighborhood in Johannesburg. And what Kerkhoff is dealing with, the film doesn't entirely work, and his films often don't entirely work, but what I think he's dealing with that is very important is a sort of notion of sexual psychosis as a product of apartheid. And that's something that I don't know of anyone else that's dealt with that. The film was, I think, received very badly at FESPACO, partly because there was no precedent for it, and there was no, in a way, there was no warning. No one knew what this film was about. It was screened to an audience that included local Burkinabe and the usual sort of critics and people who attend the festival from abroad. And there was just a furor in the theater because, I think there was just no way of laying the groundwork for a film like this in that particular context unless, you have a number of films like that have played before. And there really, I don't think, had been a film that had played like that film at FESPACO before. One last, I think, possibility for the future. There's a short film by the Burkinabe filmmaker Fanta Nakro called Puknini, which deals with sexual desire and sexual infidelity, but from the perspective of an African woman. And this is something that is also new. It's rare, I think, and one gets in the short film. It's a story of a man who essentially becomes bewitched by another woman, not his wife. And what happens as a result, and part of what happens as a result is that the two women, the man's wife and his lover, actually come to terms with one another at the man's expense. And it's an interesting story. There's a real sort of complexity and a range of tones and some contradictions also within the film that I think is unusual for this kind of story. And as I said, it ends with this sort of allegiance between the two women. So, I think there are a number of different things happening now, which includes more women making films about sexuality, includes things like Jan Kerkhoff's work, which I think is disturbing but important. But then on the other hand, you have things like the influence of Islamic law. So, at this point, it's impossible to say what will happen. I don't think that there will be a kind of sexual revolution in African film, nor do I think there is a need for that. But one does find people sort of moving off in different and very interesting directions. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to, we should thank the panel for collective and stimulating presentation, and then we'll have some questions, but I'd like to thank them first.